Well, Rose Gottemoeller was NATO's Deputy Secretary General from 2016 to 2019. Currently, she is the William J. Perry Lecturer at Stanford University's Freeman Spogoli Institute. Ms. Gottemoeller, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we cannot ignore the fact that this meeting in Brussels today was called essentially because democratic countries around the world are concerned that they can no longer rely on the United States as a dependable partner. What do you make of that assessment, that concern?
It is very concerning. Now, part of what's going on is, I have to say, very, very welcome, and that is Donald Trump during his first term in office, and I was NATO Deputy Secretary General during that period. He was demanding that NATO allies and our allies in Asia spend more on their own defense, and they started to get the message during that period. But now during his second term in office, and he's only been in office a month, but it seems like a very long time, he has really gotten that message driven home. And not only NATO allies in Europe, but also in Canada and, of course, in Asia as well, have understood that the United States is not going to be bankrolling their defense anymore, and they need to be spending more on their own defense. More concerning, and I think your question points to it, is the notion that the United States is simply withdrawing support for its longtime allied relationships. And this, I think, is concerning to all of us, both experts here in the United States, but also our allies on this continent and abroad.
How difficult is it for you, though, given the position you held with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to hear Donald Trump move closer to Russia, adopt Russian disinformation when it comes to Ukraine, call Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator? How troubling is that to you personally?
Look, Donald Trump is a man who holds grudges for a long period of time, and it's clear that he does not like Zelensky from, as he perceives it, the lack of support that Zelensky gave him for his attempts to go after Joe Biden and his family back in his first period in office. And you may recollect that that led to his first impeachment back in 2018-19. And so he does, I think, not hold a lot of affection for President Zelensky. We saw that on display a week ago in the Oval Office. Putin, on the other hand, he feels like Putin's, one of his kind of guys, obviously, and that is extraordinarily disturbing because he does pick up on Russian talking points and on Russian disinformation. And I find that very, very disturbing indeed. But let me make one more point about Putin. A week ago, right before the disastrous Oval Office meeting with Zelensky, Trump also said publicly on CNN that Putin also had to make some concessions, that he wasn't going to get everything he wanted out of this war either. And so I do think at this point we need to remember that. He's trying to get both guys to the negotiating table, and he's made it clear that both guys are going to have to make some concessions.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the meantime, as the talks continue here between the United States and Russia, Europe is talking about creating this peacekeeping force that would move into Ukraine as essentially a security guarantee for the country against any future Russian aggression. How successful would that peacekeeping force be without the United States? Because the security guarantee that Kyiv is looking for from Washington doesn't seem to be forthcoming right now.
Yes, that's very clear that Trump himself is not willing to offer up security guarantees to Ukraine. In fact, he said during that same CNN interview that I gave a moment ago that the Europeans were going to have to guarantee Ukraine's security. So I think that it is good, and we heard that at the EU summit today in Brussels, that the Europeans are stepping forward. More and more European countries are beginning to say that they would be willing to provide forces for this stabilization force or implementation force or peacekeepers, whatever it will be called in the end of the day. But I also took note today that Turkey has said that it would be willing to provide forces for such a stabilization force in Ukraine. And I think that that's very welcome news because Turkey, as you may know, has been one of the most, I would say, stable partners for the Russians as neighbors across the Black Sea, and Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has a pretty good relationship with President Putin. So if the Turks are willing to put forces into Ukraine, I think that is very significant. And furthermore, the Turks are very good in NATO operations. They always have been. In some ways, they are not a reliable ally, but in terms of NATO operations, they have always been extremely reliable. So I think that's a good sign for the success of such a stabilization force.
So good sign, as you say. Although, I do want to ask you a question about NATO writ larger, because as you know, Donald Trump has cast doubts about the need for NATO, the efficacy of NATO. We now are seeing some European leaders talking about creating a European alliance that would emerge out of NATO. Will we see the United States withdraw from the alliance? Can the alliance survive without the United States?
I certainly feared that during Trump's election campaign this time round. He threatened it explicitly. The famous quote about Vladimir Putin can do whatever the hell he wants with the NATO alliance. These were all very concerning comments during his election campaign. I have to say, since Trump took office, my concerns about an outright withdrawal from NATO have receded, because he's taken certain steps. For example, among the first of the ambassadors that he named Whitaker, nominated him as a U.S. ambassador to NATO. So to me, that was a sign that actually he expects to continue to be represented at NATO and to work with the NATO allies. Second thing that I think is rather important in this regard is the fact that he had his Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, in that difficult speech he made to the NATO allies right before the Munich Security Conference 2 weeks ago. Hegseth said point blank, "We support NATO and we support European security, full stop." This was a very, very strong statement of support, and it must have been coming directly from the president. Hegseth would not have said something so clear and firm if he had not been acting on the president's guidance. So I do think that they are beginning to make some strong statements of support for NATO now. But, we have to be doubtful about what form it's going to take going forward. Clearly, the president is thinking about moving to the Indo-Pacific, putting more emphasis on Indo-Pacific. This is nothing new. President Obama talked about the pivot to Asia over a decade ago, but maybe removing some troops from Europe. I know that really concerns the allies, moving troops from Europe and pivoting them to Asia. That's going to be very difficult. So we'll have to see what concrete steps the Trump White House is willing to take to continue to support the NATO alliance.
One last question for you, because, when we see all this talk and this almost realignment with the U.S. president being far more effusive with his comments of the Russian president, there is now a fear that we are approaching another world war. Do you see that as a potential in this moment? I've
been very worried about wider global conflict since the Russians launched their second invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, now 3 years ago. So, yes, I think we have to be concerned about wider conflict involving both the Russians and the Chinese at this juncture. And it started before Trump returned to office. The thing about the Trump administration and President Trump himself is that he's very mercurial, and you do not know from one minute to the next exactly what his decision space is going to be. I just saw the news this morning that, and I know up in Canada you're gravely concerned about the sanctions that have been imposed, and he's pulled back from sanctions against Mexico just today. So I assume your prime minister is working hard to try to get the same deal for Canada. So, this is a mercurial president, and he's going to be going one direction and the next. And I think the best we can try to do is to continue to remind Washington of where U.S. national interests lie. And to my mind, U.S. national interests lie in having strong alliances and working closely with our allies to secure the peace and secure stability.
Ms. Gottemoeller, thank you for this. I really appreciate the insight and the time today.
My pleasure.